came to the workshop yesterday, it's not necessary for me to introduce either of today's speakers. But I did want to say something about the topic, because the topic was something I'm interested in. So this is what I sort of suggested to both Marina and Bruce. But when I contacted them separately about it, it took me a long while. In fact, it took me until last week to figure out that they were talking about two different books. Bruce first told me that Marina, Bruce, and a third author, Donald Nonini, were writing a book on the corporate state. But Marina recently co-edited, co-authored a book also on the corporate state, but more specifically on the pink tide, and many of the essays in the book, I think if not all of them, have to do with Latin America. So that's even better, because I know nothing about Latin America. I'm very eager to know what her particular perspective is from in Latin America, and she's originally from Argentina anyway, and has done a lot of research there. So I sort of suggested that she sort of just start at the top, because she wrote the introduction to the book, and Bruce wrote afterward, and leave it to Bruce to say whatever he wants to say. I mean, he could talk about this particular book, or he can talk about the one that's upcoming.
The one that got away.
Or the one that got away. Okay. Or he can tell us other stories if he wants to. So, with that, I won't have it. I'll just let the speaker introduce the topic today. For those of you who are interested, she did give me the page proofs to the book that she co-edited. Actually, she sent me several essays which I found very, very interesting. These are published in Arena. The Cuckoo in the Nest, they both co-authored. Thoughts on Neoliberalism, Revelations of Capital, and the Emergence of the Corporate State, Part 1. And also on the pink tide, which she'll talk about today. So, shall we welcome them again?
Thank you. Thanks for inviting us here. And yeah, so basically the request for today was to talk about the corporate state. When we first proposed the idea of the other book, we, I suppose, imagined it was going to be further along production line. But that's a book that is still in the making, so I didn't think we really, well, I couldn't really present on that book yet. My contribution to that book would be more specifically on refugees and the corporate state. But that's a project that also emerged from the Egalitarianism grant, and that will be ongoing, and we are in the process of writing it, and we'll hopefully finish writing it by this year. So I thought that it was a good idea to present on this book, which I co-authored with another member of the Egalitarianism group, which is Alessandro Sagato. He's Italian, and he worked in Mexico on the Zapatista movement. And we put together a group of papers on the pink tide government, which I'll explain what it is for those of you who don't know. But we used the introduction to really discuss, you know, our theoretical understanding of the corporate state. Always following Bruce, because I picked up the idea of the corporate state from Bruce. Bruce has been writing about this since the 90s, and I became interested in it even before I joined Berghahn. So for me, it has been really fascinating to be able to work with Bruce on this, and for now to continue with the idea of a corporate state, because the way I see it, it's flourishing even more. You know? I mean, in the 90s, it's amazing that Bruce picked it up, but now it is very, very clear, and it's clear in the work that I did with refugees. It's clear in Latin America. It seems to be clear in in different structures around Europe. So hopefully we'll get to explore that in the book that we write with Donald Nonini. So what I'll do is I won't read through the whole introduction because it's long, but what I want to give a sense of is a bit of what the pink tide is, contextualize it and explain the relationship between neoliberalism and the pink tide, and then talk about the corporate state formation and sort of how we analyzed it in the book, how we expected the contributors of the book to engage with the theory. And then if I see that you're still awake and that you're not completely bored or time hasn't gone by too slowly, I may get into egalitarianism, because this was also part of the egalitarianism project. But it's not essential to get into that part to understand what we mean by the corporate state. So I may just finish there and we'll see how it goes. We can talk about that further in the discussion. So as Alan said, yes, I've done research in Latin America. My main research area was Cuba, but I come from Argentina, and our contributors have worked in Latin America. So this is a book produced by people that have worked in the region and that have ethnographic experience in the region from an anthropological perspective. So, the pink tide within the neoliberal wave. In the mid-2000s, 3/4 of South America's population, this is about 350 million people, were under leftist governments. The pink tide refers to a group of left-leaning, non-communist governments that rose to power at the end of the 1990s and in the new millennium in Latin America. By 2010, there were leftist governments in Argentina, Uruguay, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Paraguay, Venezuela, and Peru. The pink tide was by no means a unified bloc, and contested distinctions are drawn between the good left of Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and Chile, and which is more akin to a sort of European social democrats, and the bad left of Venezuela and Bolivia and Ecuador, which are too close to Cuba, too communist. However, the pink tide governments are broadly characterized by a reaction against neoliberal economic practices implemented by the Washington Consensus and shared common policies of increased social spending, nationalization of important industries, particularly extractivist industries, regeneration of regional trade deals, and in some cases the reformulation of constitutions to create more economies of solidarity and also reshape the idea of citizenship. These governments were in many ways a response to the 1998 regional recession caused by neoliberal policies of austerity implemented by the World Bank and extreme privatization, potentially explaining the vote to the left, not as an ideological vote, but as a rationally economic vote. The rise of the left coincided with the commodities boom of 2003, which provided leftist governments with resources with which to govern, mostly petrol, gas, and mining of different minerals and soy. This was particularly in Argentina, the agrarian sector, and enabled redistribution policies to be implemented. But it did not challenge the command of capital, and in many ways enabled the penetration of corporatizing forces through the deepening dependence on the global market of primary goods. The rise of the left to government shifts the configuration of political scenarios in Latin America to the point that even in 2013 and 14, when governmental politics began to shift again to the right, the elected conservative governments did not win by large margins. This was in Peru, in Argentina, and Brazil. These partial victories reveal the effects of leftist distributive policies and a new political scenario where the left's access to government is now possible. However, they can be also interpreted as symptoms of an increasing indistinctness between left and right, as leftist governments in power often display policies that could well have been conceived by the right, such as fascist tendencies, blurring the platforms sustained by both political camps in the past. The biggest critique leveled at the pink tide has been its understanding of undermining of democratic institutions through its association with large-scale corruption scandals, and you may have heard things about Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and the increasing subversion of the legal structures for political purposes, seen, for example, in the subordination of socio-ecological concerns to extractivist policies, and this was in Bolivia, concerns around water, access to water, and in the Amazon as well. While there might be little doubt that corruption thrived, the historic tensions within traditional elites underpinning corruption scandals are often overlooked, as well as the long-standing role of corruption within Latin American politics and more globally. The backlash of traditional power groups, the military, the Catholic Church, the oligarchy, against the newly empowered sectors of society like women, the poor, ethnic minorities, indigenous people, often through corruption accusations and legal procedures, reveals corporate interests mobilizing bureaucratic institutions to subvert political power to its economic concerns.
Do you want to slow down a little bit?
Yes.
I just missed this part and then I have to write that.
好，然后呢，刚刚就讲到说，
你还maybe I can continue first.
Neoliberalism, against which the pink tide emerged, is a peculiar form of reason that configures all aspects of existence in economic terms. This is Wendy Brown's argument. And is embedded, we argue, within the structural dynamics of the corporate state, representing the ideological framework supporting the unregulated potential of capitalism. Neoliberalism ideologically reflects and motivates the marked economization of the political and of the social, the economic as ontology, this Bruce's argument. Neoliberal reason penetrates statecraft and business, law, the production of knowledge in primary and tertiary education, the reproduction of daily life through technology, and so converts the distinctly political character, meaning, and operation of democracy's constituent elements into economic ones.
stop. 然后他刚刚就是说了那个 corruption 的问题，然后在胚胎的时候，或者他在结婚的时候，其实也会有可能说胚胎的一个 corruption 问题那一些教育是说他并不是一个程度，但他就提到说这样的，然后他也提到了就是在那个胚胎完整的时候会看到一个你可以说是用会有一个backlash，就是有一个反复，就对一些新形成的一些群体，譬如说邻居，然后一些权利运动，然后就会有一个就反复的一个状态，所以他就说，就是为什么会有这个反复出现呢？就是因为有很多的问题，它不是说有一个所谓的政权，它可以就它得到政权以后，它可以解决到，是因为有一些比较深层次的问题，它是深深的陷入在那一个结构当中，然后它就扩跟问题状，然后又扩跟主要就是讲明这个点，就是它是深深它部分陷在里面，不是说新政府一个系统，旧政府一个系统，而且它会完全穿透在譬如日常的譬如知识生产，譬如是法律系统等等。好 ，OK， continue。
That is, neoliberalism represents the subverting of the political by the economic, becoming a dominant economistic discourse across class and political spectrum, one that has the capacity to bind its critics and proponents under the terms of the market logic. Thus, right, left, public, private, democratic, autocratic, and other apparent oppositions, constituting a dialectical unity of meaning, are internal to and become internalized into the logic of the corporate state and get mobilized in times of crisis, subverting egalitarian ideals and democratic processes. The demise of the pink tide, therefore, ought to be considered as a manifestation of larger transformations of the state, a historical process long underway, and not simply as a pendular movement between left and right, between left and rightist claims over power, over state power, nor a response to a commodity boom of the 1990s, a much too simplistic and economistic understanding of a complex and ongoing process of shifting state structures. So I turn now to a theory of the corporate state. The corporate state formation. When we speak of the corporate state, we depart from older theories of state corporatism popular in the 1970s. There are certainly continuities between early conceptualizations of the corporate state, such as those in the 1930s fascism, the state corporatism of Italian fascism, and the current manifestations of the corporate state in Trump's America. But the corporate state we refer to is a more radical state formation than a corporatism of state or the corporatization of state sectors through privatization, for example. Some elements of state corporatism have been repopularized, like the suspicion against liberal democracy, the idea that not all citizens are equal as a positive force of economic development, the prioritization of the economy in state concerns, anti-systemic and anti-establishment reactions, the technocratization of state practices, the retreat of society, the disjunction with the nation, and the penetration of military law into civic sphere, and the internationalization of war. However, there are new elements that have enabled or even more an even more radical configuration of state structures into what we, following Kapferer, identify as the corporate state. We refer to a transmogrification of the nation state. That is, the corporate state is inherent within the structures and history of the nation state into a new assemblage of people-state relations that radically reconfigures social life. Since the early 1990s, renowned authors like Zygmunt Bauman, Jürgen Habermas, Manuel Castells, Ulrich Beck, among others, have proclaimed the crisis of statehood and predicted the possible disappearance of the nation-state. Since then, theories of state weakening achieved such an outstanding popularity that they almost became a cliché. Governments from left and right adopted these theories to justify widespread privatization campaigns. In the academic field, ideas of state weakness, failed states, the retreat of the state, the demise of the state are quite popular and rather transversal in ideological spectrum. Recently, Alain Badiou has provocatively observed that the Marxist theme of the withering away of the state, the idea that the eradication of the capitalist state, that after the eradication of the capitalist state, a stateless society would be created, defined by Marx as free association, has now become a key tendency of globalized capitalism. Given its transnational scope, this system has no particular interest in the subsistence of a territorially based nation-state. These conditions, Badiou argues, generate processes of weakening of the state which he identifies as a crucial tendency today. It is irrefutable that there are transnational economic processes and institutions like markets, large corporations, and supranational poles of power that transcend state jurisdiction. However, ideas of state weakening seem to be themselves influenced by the dominant economic doctrine of neoliberalism, to the point that they corroborate a conception of global economic forces as free, detached, and autonomous. However, we argue, neoliberalism is more than an economic doctrine, and it takes on an ontological force behind the reconfiguration of state structures that gives rise to the corporate state. It also appears that ideas of state weakening tend to identify statehood with a specific configuration or typology of the state, which is currently undermined by global tendencies, but does not embody or represent statehood as such. Statehood not only transcends concrete historical forms of the state, it also plays an active and key role in the expansion of capitalism, which, according to Polanyi, is facilitated by state structures, tying their logic to specific territories. For Wallerstein, a system resting on unlimited accumulation needs to be grounded in structural mechanisms by which those who act with other motivations are penalized in some way and are eventually eliminated from the social scene, whereas those who act with the appropriate motivations are rewarded. Thus, global capitalism needs a multiplicity of states, so that capitalist initiatives can give the advantage of working with states, but also can circumvent states hostile to their interests in favor of states friendly to their interests. This is Wallerstein's argument. We developed the idea that rather than weakening or disappearing, a historical transmutation of statehood is underway, albeit one that was inherent in the structure of the nation state and could result in a new paradigm of the idea of the state. In his recent work, Bruce Kapferer and Catherine Bertelsen articulate the problem in terms of a transition towards the corporate state, a configuration of statehood where the economic logic becomes ontologically foundational, permeating all social and political relations. In the corporate state formation, the market does not exist as a separate entity, but it becomes the principle of social processes. This happens under the effect of political tendencies that in themselves recognize their own constitution in the dynamics of the economy and the market. The idea of a corporate state suggests that the market and the conceptualization of the economic are not so much resubmerged in the social and in the political, but become their very constitution and form. Neoliberalism is the ideology of the corporate state, which makes the economic a foundational force in the formation of social worlds. Highlighting the increasing assimilation of the dominant economic logic by the state, the influence over the capture of its political, executive, and controlling mechanisms by corporate interests allows us to understand the two entities as akin, somehow overlapping, and not as opposing, excluding, or weakening each other. Starting from the Mexican case, Zagato identifies three main related tendencies or symptoms of state corporatization observable throughout Latin America. Namely, the disintegration of a sense of collectivity and public institutionality, the disappearance of what Habermas has described as the public sphere, an increased tendency to internal warfare, and widespread forms of dispossession related to extractivism. More concretely, in a phase of transition towards the corporate state, warfare seems to turn into a form of governance for its capacity to deeply shape realities and mold subjectivities and forms of life. A hint of this tendency is seen in securitization policies implemented in the name of fighting terrorism, as we saw this morning. Corporatization seems to require aggressive forms of social fragmentation and the disarticulation of the state's civil functions. State corporatization is a global tendency. In Latin America, it has undergone a tremendous acceleration since the end of the 1980s. The Washington Consensus promoted liberalization of the markets, economic openness, and the elimination of trade barriers, reinforcing the role of market economy. Following this trend, the majority of the governments of Latin America negotiated their debt and signed asymmetrical free trade agreements with the United States. Through this strategy identified by Naomi Klein as the shock doctrine, the United States attempted to bond Latin American societies to their economy, ensuring the free movement of capital, goods, and services, but the bondage of people to an indebted government through austerity policies in corporate interests. This had a decisive impact on Latin American statehood and radically reshaped its societies. Privatization and deregulation policies, usually described as neoliberal, are not, however, simply economic. These governmental interventions alter the structure of the state, including its territories and forms of life. For example, the free market treaty signed by Mexico involved constitutional changes in terms of land rights, which had a structural impact on territory, sovereignty, and collective forms of land tenure. Such changes inaugurated the extractivist model that is currently shaping Mexican corporatization. This process has also variably affected land rights in Chile and Argentina within indigenous communities. State corporatization in Argentina has followed the same principle of reducing as much as possible the freedom of maneuver of public policies that do not pursue structural neoliberal reforms. This process covers the dictatorship phases of 1976 to 1983 and the years between 1989 and the neoliberal decade of 1989 to 2001 under a constitutional government. The military coup and the assassination of Allende in Chile, as well as the dictatorship of Pinochet in Chile after Allende's assassination, were also aimed at crushing processes of widespread politicization and the democratization of the Chilean state. This process turned Chile into an unprecedented neoliberal experiment, where state corporatization was enforced through structural adjustment that later contributed to shaping the Washington Consensus for the rest of Latin America. These included the promulgation of a new constitution, facilitating denationalization and the imposition of extractivist policies and privatization. Peru, under Fujimori, was another instance of purposefully reformulating social and political processes through the national model under the Fujimori shock. An analysis of state corporatization in Latin America should always consider the priority that the region constitutes for the United States in military and economic terms. Weakness and strength are relative concepts when applied to a state like Mexico, for example, whose unconditional subordination to the will of the northern neighbor couples with solid internal military and oligarchic domination. The emergence since the early 2000s of so-called progressive or pink-tide governments in the region might be interpreted as an attempt at containing and limiting the effects of widespread state corporatization through the introduction of egalitarian elements in the functioning of the corporate state. This was indeed a phase of egalitarian experimentalism at a level of governmental politics. As a general tendency, these governments reconfigured national economies through reforms that attempted to correct the negative effects of the market, redistributing national wealth and retaking control of strategic economic sectors. This allowed them to redirect funds towards internal social policies that contributed to alleviate poverty and marginality. In Argentina, for example, following the crisis of 2001, some workers' movements took over factories in an attempt to recreate labor relations in more egalitarian ways, away from the patronage of government policies and as an alternative to docile neoliberal subjectivities. Since 2014, the fall of the prices of oil and other commodities has had a negative impact on the Latin American region. Its consequences have been particularly deleterious for the pink-tide governments and their social policies that depended on the sale of those natural resources. This crisis was has amplified many of the critiques that were already targeting these experiences, predominantly on what concerns their reliance on extractivism as the basis of national wealth. The main critique is that they failed to eradicate a persisting neo-colonial model of exportation of raw material, and that there was no real attempt to radically question or dismantle the model that they were declaring to oppose. Referring to his government's experiences in Bolivia, Álvaro García Lineras summarized the model as follows: a strong state that regulates the expansion of the industrial economy, extracting its surpluses and transferring them to the community in order to promote forms of self-organization, and a typical Andean and Amazonian trading model. He adds that Andean Amazonian capitalism is the way that better adapts to our reality, to the Bolivian reality, improving the possibilities of labor and community emancipation in the medium term. This is what we conceive as a temporary and transitory mechanism. This is still Lineras talking. End of quote. On the one hand, the pervasiveness of this mechanism is still to be empirically demonstrated, not just because structural changes in a single national economic paradigm is something very complicated, even when one of these pillars of governmentality, which is the high international price of commodities, comes down, but also because the solid and social and ecological effects of extractivism are frequently irreversible, to the extent that critical points of view consider extractivism as an authentic war against the people. On the other hand, the use of the economic surplus by these governments to improve the living conditions of the population brought objective improvements and opened the possibility for the development of forms of egalitarian political and social organization. For instance, the Venezuelan comunas are radical popular experiments, in many cases independent from the state apparatus, and are meant to persist even in the cases of governmental change. In Cuba, the increase of self-employment and the cooperative ventures that emerged in the early 2000s have served as experiments, even while they are state-sanctioned experiments, for new configurations of labor and class relations at times of severe crisis, and in often contradictory ways, as egalitarian movements contesting the accumulation of resources in the hands of state and other powerful groups, like emigre Cubans in the US, for example. Progressive governments of the pink tide could not, we argue, overcome corporatization. They merely implemented policies to limit privatization and partially redistribute national income. They introduced egalitarian elements into the structure of the state, which was, however, almost entirely preserved. Through access to political structures, the new right-wing parties are rapidly dismantling the social politics and processes of regional integration that their predecessors initiated. However, an indication of the pervasiveness of the corporate state is the blurring of distinctions between governmental right and left as the interests of capital take over political ideologies. This is evident in Argentinian politics as the Peronists, transmogrified these days into the Kirchneristas, become a vehicle for state power, but along their history have represented both social programs of redistribution and as well as austerity measures. Early 2018 protests organized by the Venezuelan right appropriated forms of action, slogans, and symbols that are typical of the left, particularly of the anti-globalization movements, projecting a very ambiguous image of themselves in appealing to freedom and human rights. However, crucially, the sharpest critique to the pink tide model did not come from right-wing formations, but from new egalitarian tendencies embodied in groups, frequently of indigenous background and other minorities, who are producing different forms of collectives, that is, forms of life that go beyond corporatization because they are totally incompatible with the state form. This is important as it might represent a more radical response to the spread of neoliberalism, which has penetrated left and right political ideologies and amalgamated political difference under an economic model of management. So I'm going to finish there because it's a bit dense. And also Bruce's afterwards will fit well by extending on the theory of the corporate state. Want to go straight into it? Do you want to sit here?
That's fine, I can sit here, I think.
Can we just wait?
Yeah. This is a reaction to the book as a whole, which is a really good read and very, very interesting for someone like me, particularly who knows nothing about Latin America, really, except what I've read in the newspapers or in the Monde Diplomatique and various other organs of information. So it's a reaction to some aspect of that, and one aspect of the organisation of the book, which is necessary to the argument, is to focus on particular countries, all the major countries in South America and some in Mexico and so on, but and in Central America. But what aspect I'm interested in having a look at as well is that in-betweenness, the fact that the corporate state is actually outside territorial sovereignties as much and as more than it is within them. This is a critical aspect of it. Anyhow, this is my reaction, and I'll make some comments as I go along. There's a great book that's just come out, incidentally, I think, quite popularly written, beautifully written, by a person that lives in, historian that lives and works in India, an Englishman that lives in India, William Dalrymple. You probably know of him. William Dalrymple's The Anarchy has just been published. It's a wonderful book, and it wonderfully reminds us that India, the jewel in the crown of imperial Britain, was born in the rapacious actions of a trading corporation, the East India Company, oriented to extraction of maximum profit. Citing Edmund Burke, Dalrymple writes, "The company would, at last, like a viper, be the destruction of the country which fostered it at its bosom," close quotes. In the virtual anarchy that the company wrought, as Dalrymple describes, was its emergence as the colonial state, eventually to metamorphose via reforms, resistance, and the achievements of national independence into the contemporary nation-state of the Republic of India. Presenting his key point on the joint stock company that was the East India Company, Dalrymple states, and I quote him again, "We still talk about the British conquering India, but the phrase disguises a more sinister reality. It was not the British government that began seizing great chunks of India in the mid-18th century, but a dangerously unregulated private company headquartered in one small office, 5 windows wide, in London, and managed in India by a violent, utterly ruthless, and intermittently mentally unstable corporate predator, Robert Clive." Close quotes. The Victorians thought that the real stuff of history was the politics of the nation state. This, not the economics of corrupt corporations, they believed was the fundamental unit of study and the real driver of transformation in human affairs. Close quotes. What happened in India was repeated around the globe as part of the European expansion, east, north, south, and west. Many of you have probably been to London, and the great monument to go and look at is the Albert Memorial. It's an outrage, but it expresses that point absolutely. The prime instruments were not just adventurers in search of riches, but often organised in the form of joint stock companies that assumed the virtual autonomy of states, corporate republics in some current nomenclature, complete with their own administrative apparatus and instruments, police and military, for the monopolisation of violent control, frequently backed by the sovereign territorial states that extended them charter. These companies, the EIC was among the most outstanding, were deterritorialising and in effect themselves territorially unlimited. The domains of their sovereignty constrained by the violent competition of other territorially sovereign state-backed companies or corporate republics in the regions that they entered and which were opened to grab. The broad, if arguably unexceptionable point, is that the still dominant global form of the nation state saw its emergence in the political, economic, social and religious transformations of Europe that were also the circumstances for the formation of capitalism, tied to the emergence of the bourgeoisie and their rule. Marx, of course, developed this understanding the most clearly, also recognising the moral and political order of the nation state, its liberal ideology, its civilising mission, that masked, as it may have tempered, the violence and oppressive, hierarchising, suppressive and marginalising forces at the heart of the nation state. Now, Thomas Hobbes wrote his highly influential, conservative, monarchist, traditionalist treatise on the state, Leviathan, in reaction to what he experienced. This is, I think, a really important point, in what he experienced as the socially destructive and fractious individualist competitiveness of the merchant groups in London. The famous phrases of his were actually directed at the merchant groups, not at some essentialist vision of humanity, even though that's what he developed, and even though he was influenced by Thucydides and people like him, first translator of Thucydides, of course. He was aiming his shots at the merchant groups, the adventure capitalists, vital to imperialist enterprise and the forming of the nation state. The nation state is an ideological and political economic formation that has a capitalist corporatist dynamic at its beginnings and centre, the predatory and savage dimension of such a dynamic being domesticated or subordinated and regulated to the legal and socio-moral political orders of the nation state. It's out of that savage expansion that, in a sense, the nation state forms around, and it's that savagery which is at the centre of the nation state, which I argue is reappearing in new form. Now, much discussion on contemporary political processes in Marina and Zagato's volume on South and Central American states conceive their crises as being connected to neoliberalism and resistance to it. This is sometimes treated, I think unfortunately, not in the book however, as relatively recent, reaching a high point in the era of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, for instance, and extending from it. But it should be clear here what is addressed as neoliberalism has its foundation in the world of the formation of the nation state, the very formation of it, that savage beginning. What is referred to in Marina's book as the corporate state was born with the creation of the nation state. The hollowing out of the nation state, the feature of the current historical moment, and effectively the nation state's reconfiguration as the corporate state, is little short of the apotheosis or full actualization of capital and its pragmatism for profit mediated through social and political formations of class and what was already imminent in the nation state, a phenomenon that was coincident with the European and North American imperialism and the establishment of the roots of capitalism as the global energy of modernity and post-modernity. I stressed the dynamic and especially the inner capitalist corporate process integral to nation-state formation as one of deterritorialization and reterritorialization in the sense that Deleuze and Guattari used the concepts. They are akin, of these concepts of course, to the destructive creative dynamic that Marx and others recognize to be distinctive of capital, its capacity to adapt and transform to shifting circumstances in the undying hunger to extract the greatest profit. Such is particularly evident at the imperial colonial outreach that involved the radical restructuring or reformation of the socio-political and ecological terrains of the imperial intrusions. The class, ethnic and racial hierarchies and other forms of social marginalization in the cases presented in Marina and Zagato's volume exemplify this point. It is a dynamic of socio-political and cultural invention and reinvention that builds and rebuilds the social and political ground for capital. The ground of capital recreates itself recreates its own ground. This is clear in the processes of bourgeois control and the continual struggles of bourgeois social and political fractions to reproduce their dominance through a process of changing alliances and betrayals, I think, of course, brilliantly discussed by Marx in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon. The dynamic of which continues, I think, in what we might see as the unfolding tragedies of Trump's presidency and in the wranglings of the UK's Brexit. The same kind of process that Marx picked up is beautifully expressed. I think that I've not seen enough analyses of the application of the 18th Brumaire to England, for example. It's a perfect example of the current restructurings of Boris Johnson and the realliances with working class or the ex-working class in Northern England fit the bill perfectly, as is going to be their betrayal in the next couple of years. Such is also starkly apparent in the chapters in this volume. Now, one critical thesis of the volume concerns the recurrent pattern of hierarchical forces giving way to egalitarian energies of socio-political liberation, the opening up of opportunities for the oppressed and marginalised, etc. Only for these to give way, again, to hierarchical orders or reactive programs. A major conceptual understanding in the book relates to the fact that hierarchy and egalitarian processes are not mutually exclusive. As I think is well recognised, paradoxically, egalitarian ideologies often embed hierarchical and exclusivist potential, often of a racist kind that present-day populism, for example, throughout much of the globe evinces. Further, egalitarian forces are premised on the imagination of hierarchy, as they are motivated most often by the constraining, oppressive, virtually life-extinguishing and marginalising effects of hierarchical power. More generally, it is the history of state formation that underpins the unity of hierarchical with egalitarian dynamics, the mutuality of their implication, in which apparent egalitarianising developments come to function from the perspective of social and political order as a whole, as a means for the reproduction of that order. What can appear as revolutionary, as the American materials so tragically demonstrate, ultimately operates counteractively as a process of reassemblage and continuity. Egalitarian forces are in the language of the kind of market logics that receive heightened value in this era of the corporate state, little other than system corrections. They are moments of social and political readjustment in the reformation of inequitable social orders. The mutual implication of hierarchical and egalitarian dynamics in state systems, and especially those of the nation state, have a lot to do with the historically produced structural relations of class and race dominated by the bourgeoisie, by and large the agents of capital, and, most importantly, a class category in continual formation. It's a dynamic process in capital, drawing its members from all points across the social spectrum. The colonial authorities, that was their main policy, and it was an explicit policy to build a bourgeoisie that was linked up from various sections of the populations they intruded upon. It is largely among the bourgeoisie that discourse couched in hierarchical and egalitarian terms is the most intense. That's us, perhaps. The bourgeoisie provide the bulk of conservatives and radicals, however these are defined. It is such discourse, usually of a classic or conventional left-right kind, that comprises the terms of the political alignment of fractions of the bourgeoisie in controlling the socio-political orders that are affected by capital and who become willy-nilly agents in the transitions and transformations of the circumstances for the survival of capital and its expansion. The hierarchical egalitarian cycle might be understood as closely connected to what has been discussed in the heyday of the European nation state, for example, by the likes of Pareto, Moscow, Michel's, as the circulation of elites, a revolving or redistribution of power among dominant groups who share similar class interests, even if they have different visions of how these may be preserved. But perhaps this cycle is approaching its limit. and is at the threshold of new potential, in Max Weber's understanding, perhaps a switching moment in history of revolutionary frustration and deepening inequity. I think we're at a switch, at one of those Weberian switch points right now. The circulation of power within dominant elites and the cross-class, race and gender aspects of these, and the shifting alliances or consequent reassembling of relations yielding benefit, if often momentary, for sections of the wider, frequently disadvantaged population, facilitated the continuity of an inequitable social order despite or because of its contradictions. The circulation of elites might be conceived as a kind of political and economic redistributive dynamic that enabled particular class interests by drawing others into its web of alliance. The emergence of what is addressed in Marina's book as the corporate state gains significance in this regard. What is described as the corporate state, as Marina and Zagato stress, involves a reconfiguration and redetermination and submission of the orders of the nation-state to the rationalism of the economic, to an economistic pragmatism that pervades most areas of socio-political existence. If it is an outcome of neoliberalism, the imaginary of the corporate state is its most potent manifestation. Thus, what has led to the emergence of the corporate state is a desire to institutionalize neoliberal ideology against resistances generated in the contradictions and conflicts, effectively class forces, born of the capitalism that conditions the society of the nation state. The ascendance of the corporate state from within the shell of the nation state reveals itself as an attack on democratic value, frequently in its name, bearing that shade of the fascism of the recent past in cries of greater efficiency. The corporatization of the nation state is associated not just with privatization and outsourcing, but with the widespread managerialization of bureaucracy, the creation of managerial hierarchies of control relatively free of democratic contingency, and the general establishment of a productive ethos, auditing and other methods of productive control as a vital dimension of the social relations, reconceived in terms of the maximization of productive effort. The impetus is against any kind of social disruption threatening a harmony of control. The corporate state is an imagination of the socio-political frame, largely in terms of a business model founded along the lines of rational economic individualism, whose rationality is defined by results relative to the energy expended. Now, Manuel de Landa expresses in much of his work a philosophy appropriate to the rise of the corporate state, in addition to an appreciation of the new technologies, most specifically relating to digitalization, that has facilitated the corporate state and the societies of its control, to use the phrase of Deleuze, and surveillance, as Zuboff has recently described, what may be regarded as the anti-democratic effects of the emergence of the corporate state. Such effects manifest as an attack on forms of the social that emerged in history initially outside the history of capital, and or which took form as resistant entities through the force of capital as in protest shaped in the relations of class, race and gender. What might be described as the corporatization of the social and the political has encouraged the fractionalization of contesting groups and social categories, often engaging in egalitarianizing ethos, individualist emphasis against their collectivist possibility, a paradox of much egalitarianism with hierarchical effect. A radical restructuring of social and political terrains is in process. Class inequalities have intensified in corporatism, associated with post-industrialism and new innovative forms of production and marketing, linked to what is often referred to as the gig economy, along with a growing incapacity of the increasingly exploited and dispossessed to resist. I think we're seeing that everywhere. And sometimes, I think Leclerc picked this up early in relationship to populism in Argentina. I really liked Leclerc's attack on the still insistence on too many Marxists, I think, to use industrial north of England as the sort of model for the analyses, and not looking at the very different histories under which various types of class formation took point. I mean, Leclerc makes that point very early on, I think, and it has relevance, I think, for this sort of thing. What I'm suggesting is that the rise of the corporate state subverts the repetitive or recurrent cycle of mutually implicated hierarchical egalitarian processes. Hierarchical forces gain sway, and egalitarian processes are relatively suppressed to build increasingly towards system-overturning revolutionary potential. Perhaps there are indications of this revolutionary spirit, which I think is around. I think, however, it's why it's a switch moment. It looks revolutionary. Maybe it'll be fantastically conservative again and fascist, which is a very big possibility. But nonetheless, something's happened which is producing this sense of revolution, which I think there are good indications in recent events in Bolivia, for example, as I read, and in Chile, as well as a widespread ramping up of socio-political violence throughout the societies concerned, as Mexico possibly illustrates. As already indicated, the wave of populist political action that is explicitly antagonistic not just to political elites, but to the established political party systems of many nation-state orders, gives a sense of growing impatience altogether with the corporatizing change in the socio-political orders of many nation-states. This is assuming an international dimension, even as national sentiments are receiving increasing voice, the latter in certain cases being an effect of reform. I mean, what happened at one point is coming around again. I think very much, one person I really love reading is Rosa Luxemburg, and her accounts of the importance of the socialist movement, which was gaining a lot of force, as you know, before the First War, and certainly during it. She was asking for organisation, aware that, in the sense that this movement could be hijacked by conservative interests, which indeed it was, which led, in fact, to her murder. But what is very interesting is even again now the populism that has been, which has been coming up and sort of expressing, I think, many processes that are part of corporate state formation. We're in that very tense moment, I think, when this thing, which has got a revolutionary spirit about it, could easily turn and reproduce to some extent some of the horrors of the recent, not so distant past. As already indicated, the wave of populist political action that is explicitly antagonistic not just to political elites, but to the established political party systems of many nation-state orders, gives a sense of growing impatience altogether with the corporatizing change in the socio-political orders of many states. This is assuming an international dimension, even as national sentiments are receiving increasing voice, the latter in certain cases being an effect of the former. Contemporary populism expresses a frustration with the democratic process that is the basis of state legitimacy. But this impatience is to a growing extent beyond nation-state control, whose erstwhile sovereignty has been compromised by the globalizing processes that are to a major degree driven in the rise of the corporate state, whose potency draws from its cross-state or internationally networked bases as much as, or even more than, from its supposed national home base. The nationalist turn of much populism is in many aspects a reaction to the rise of the corporate state, whose agents, even as they act within the political order of nation-states, are becoming more alienated from the populations they claim to represent. So we're actually getting a process, I think, which is really quite relevant to the current moment, and that is a kind of schismatic tendency in class relations, so that you're getting elites that are more and more alienated from the populations. There's a shift of the conditions of the sort of thing that Marx wrote about in his work on the 18th Brumaire. There's this movement where you've got the divorce of governing elites into a space. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm just repeating myself. So, just to go there, contemporary populism expresses a frustration with the democratic process that is the basis of state legitimacy. But this impatience is to a growing extent beyond nation-state control, whose erstwhile sovereignty has been compromised by globalizing processes that are to a major degree driven in the rise of the corporate state, whose potency draws from its cross-state or internationally networked bases. The nationalist turn of much populism is in many respects and aspects a reaction to the rise of the corporate state, whose agents, even if they act within the political order of nation-states, are becoming more alienated from the populations they represent. So the essays in Marino and Zagato's volume concentrate on the socio-political dynamics within nation-states, but with the rise of the corporate state, the forces of domination and control have slipped the domains of even limited democratic possibility. It is in the spaces outside nation-states, perhaps more than within them, that the forces for expanding social and political abjection, driven in new realizations of capitalist potential, more and more impervious to the human suffering that is occurring, is building. The current historical moment is sometimes referred to, in a different sense, as the post-human, and the irony of such a label, I think, should not be missed.
We usually break for 10 minutes, then we come back.
Okay.
But, yeah, we can break 10 minutes. We need the extra 5 minutes. Too heavy.
Yeah.
No, simple. Not Marina's. Really.
Oh, it's true.
Would you like to start off?
How would you translate corporate state in other languages you are familiar with?
Spanish?
In Spanish?
Estado corporativo, l'État corporatif, I suppose in French.
No, it doesn't work.
It doesn't work?
Because corporative doesn't mean that at all.
In Spanish, Estado corporativo, sí.
In German?
I
don't know. No idea.
My German is very basic, I couldn't. Yeah.
Any one of you
Because
Chinese?
In Chinese?
In Chinese?
Ellen?
No.
No, because, you know, when it's a matter of concept, so it's a philosophical issue, basically. When one has trouble for translating, making a concept travel into another language, it sometimes means that there's a problem about the concept itself. See what I mean? It's like, I would say, area studies. Have you ever tried to translate area studies in any other language than American? No, doesn't make sense. Area studies doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Maybe in Chinese, I don't know, but in French doesn't make sense. So no, this is why I was asking. Corporate state for me. Okay, I understand what, of course, I can follow you, but if I have to translate it into French, no idea.
Can't do it.
Since they're talking about words, can I just follow up on this? Okay, because I'll just reread actually the passage from Kapferer and Berghahn that Marina referred to. where he defines the corporate state. And I'll just reread. Kapferer and Berghahn articulated the problem in terms of transition towards a corporate state, a configuration of statehood where the economic logic becomes ontologically foundational, permeating all social and political relations. In the corporate state formation, the market does not exist as a separate entity, but it becomes the principle of social processes. When I read this sentence, the very first thing that came to mind was William Dalrymple, the same person that Bruce referred to. And I remember I was looking for a particular phrase that but I couldn't remember where it came from. So I started Googling, and finally I found an essay which was on the Dutch version of the VOC, the Dutch version of British East India Company, where he cites exactly the phrase that I was looking for, and I'll just read it here. Under the title The Original Evil Corporation, William Dalrymple recently assessed the British East India Company, EIC, as, quote, an empire within an empire with the power to make war or peace anywhere in the East, unquote. The EIC represents a taproot for the emergence of today's global corporations, possessing, quote, a fatal blend of power, money, and unaccountability, unquote. Nowadays, they no longer need their own armies. National banks are ready to save them with their substantial bailout potentials, while secret services organize for them a bloody regime changes, unquote. Now, it's kind of ironic that you mentioned what's his name, the modern world system, Wallerstein, because I remember arguing with a student who said, well, you know, Wallerstein does talk about the nation state, and I said, no, that's not the way I read it, because if you read the general argument that he's trying to make about capitalism as a historical formation, which of course we know that has, you know, depends on imperialist, expansionist tendencies. That's how these two things are linked together. Yeah, he does mention the nation state, but the nation state it's an invisible hand that's really suppressed. Otherwise, you know, how can you talk about, you know, this capitalism as this kind of autonomous formation? But it's there, true. But if you read Dalrymple literally for what he just said here, I mean, he actually says that the so-called statist corporation is really comes straight out of colonialism, right? It comes out of the colonial state, or what was
colonialism, yeah.
What was the state at that time.
Comes out of these companies.
Yeah, and there's a certain kind of process which is actually the opposite of the process that you're talking about. If this is the statist corporation, in other words, the state that evolves and creates the modern corporation, versus the state which takes on corporate form, I mean, it's another way of saying that this process has been ongoing for a long time, and this may shift back and forth. Okay, that's my own observation.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not I wouldn't disagree with that at all. I would disagree. What I'm saying, I just want to make a point that, at least in my position at the moment, is always changing, so I'm interested in what you're saying very much. But one of my first objections is actually the term neoliberalism. So this is a much used concept, and you know,
much abused concept.
It's a much whatever it means. I'm not ever sure, but it's sort of you know, it's a bit like capitalism.
Sure.
But it's a much used concept, and it's sort of seen as a relatively recent thing. And I'm saying that it's not terribly useful unless we move into looking at the kinds of structures that are involved and the matching with certain ideological arguments and actually the structures that relate to and also it has a long-term history. So I'm interested also in the formation of the nation state, because the nation state has very, at least in its European versions, there are different versions of it, has a very interesting history. And the history of its formation, at least if I look at it from the English side of things, that something, is really something that comes into being as a function of a whole series of political economic processes connected with state expansion of a particular kind, which then transforms in relationship to what began it in a sense. So India is a very interesting case. India is a case of, in a sense, producing a particular kind of liberal formation out of an attempt to control these organizations like the South Sea Company or the Hudson's Bay Company or the British South Africa Company, to bring them into line with certain types of interests in the home territorial state, in order to combat some of the destructions that were occurring back home at the time as a result of these formations, and also to bring some sort of structure into that imperial control which was gradually developing itself all over the place. And so I'm interested in actually the nation state as something which follows out of these kinds of processes and has these processes at its thorough base. And then going back to some of the classic books like Hobbes, for example. Now Hobbes's whole theory of the nation state not only relates to resistances and violence within England at the time, but is all about the liberation movements and so forth, the Protestant Reformation, all these sorts of things that were going on. Hobbes is really frightened with the development of these new merchant groups within London, as was Sir Thomas More. Sir Thomas More's Utopia is a very interesting piece of work because he's anti-capitalist. That's part of his attack on Henry VIII. And he begins actually in a very anthropological sense to have a look at other systems like Peru, for example, as an alternative to the kind of destruction of the English economy at the time by the emergence of London and its new adventure capitalists at the centre. Hobbes is the same. His new moral order of the nation state and so forth that he's sort of pushing is very much connected to these kinds of things. And I think it relates also to his work on Thucydides, for example. He's the first translator of Thucydides, and looking at the collapse of the state system through various kinds of expansionist, adventure capitalist, if I can put it that way, programs from ancient Greece and the fragmentation of structures. So that's what I'm broadly thinking about when I sort of push this, so that the savagery of early expansion is brought under control with this moral order of the nation state, which becomes the moral order of imperial rule to some extent. But within it is this savagery that is destroying everything in its wake. And that's what Dalrymple's point is, that these corporations actually produced anarchy, which was India for a good part of the time, with competing sections all over, the actual cracking of just about everything. So I think that what we're into now is, in a sense, the re-emergence of this savagery in new form, mediated by things like digitalization, new technologies, all these sorts of things. And we're watching a new kind of destruction as well as transformation in the nature of capital itself. gentleman over the top. I mean, that's what I'm trying to get at. So it's not a singular kind of institution. It's something which is continually in transformation, and at the moment it's exhibiting the savagery that was present at the beginning and the destructiveness of that savagery. But I'm saying there's a new, I'm trying to suggest, which I'm still thinking about, I'm trying to suggest something else, that that this indicated it when I had a, I sort of came in and said about the schizoid tendencies in class relations. What you've got is a real alienation, it seems to me, of power, not just in elite formation, but in class groups which are now operating almost independently of any other relation. So it's moving out of the situation of the 18th Brumaire, where you've got dominant class groups that have got to maintain alliances with peasantry, with industrial workers, all these sort of things. All that sort of stuff is beginning to go away, and I haven't, and so that we've got a period of real alienated control and development, which we're getting situations where I think there's growing limited interest in populations that are marginalised and excluded. These populations matter less and less, even if they are, in terms of national elections, appealed to. They can be easily, the structures of betrayal are much more savage and likely to develop further. If I look at places like Australia, which is a corporate state, if ever there was one, and which survived the Great Recession of 2008 because of its mineral wealth, the fact that it's selling its mineral wealth to China and India and everywhere else, which is maintaining the sort of economy of the place. The actual separation of political elites from the base is quite remarkable. If you look at the fires, for example, in Australia at the moment, and you can understand some of the conflagration as to do with the real disinterest by people in state control over expanding infrastructural support and so forth to local communities so that they can actually control this. So it's not just about climate change, it's about actually this transformation which has happened within states. What I'm thinking, I've just been sort of thinking more about it, resurrect old work. Like I was looking at the elite stuff that came out with, the people, Pareto and Mosca and so on, for instance. But like a classic sort of Marxist American sociologist, C. Wright Mills, on the power elite, a very interesting book to reread, it seems to me. Because his critique of corporate structures and elite structures in America applies to the kind of thing that I'm thinking about here and Marina's writing about, but with new parameters to it. And thinking about all this, the securitization that Marina talks about, the stuff that Shoshana Zublov's book, I think, that can really be expanded if you took this corporate state notion I mean, I'm going all over the place, but I didn't talk about it here. But I look even at, like for example, if you've got Latour, you've got Deleuze, in fact, people I like reading and pursuing. But when I think about things, of course, all these theories are organic to the political economies in which they're thought up. Durkheim and Weber are theorists of the born within the era of the establishment of the nation state, and their theories reflect it perfectly, even if they're good theories. The same thing with all this assemblage stuff, network stuff, Castell stuff, in the sense their views of the world are very much related to the actual world that they're trying to talk about. And when they produce a generalized theory, you wonder about the generalized capacity or the generalizing capacity of that theory, because it seems to be very much rooted in a transformation that they're talking about, in fact, often effectively, certainly Deleuze, I think. But it's got limitations to it. That theory's got the limitations of the world, in fact, which gave it birth. That's the way I'm trying to think. In the same way that Marxist theory, if it's based on Northern England, it's got a fantastic limitation, I think, in the current situation. So the sort of disillusionment that some Marxists are having about the current situation is a disillusionment caused by not shifting. I think Leclerc and people like that were thinking rather healthily, actually, which some other people could have taken on more seriously. I think Leclerc's been taken more seriously. I don't know if that makes sense.
Sam, I need some digestion of the idea of corporate state, but probably by raising some potential cases for application. Well, actually, I can thought of three. One is like Marina mentioned, the recession of 1998 becomes the course to later peak climate. The same recession happened in East Asia, and plagued like South Korea, Indonesia, Thailand, and I don't know whether the response after that, on the recession, how is different, and how we can use the idea of a corporate state to see this. Particularly, a country like South Korea. Okay, and then my second case is Marina mentioned that it gradually becomes the indistinguishableness between the left and right regime, because all following some the corporate interest, right? The indistinguishableness. Similar things, I think, happened in the socialist regime of Mitterrand in France, which is quite disappointing to many leftists, and by the implementation of a certain so-called neoliberal policy. So this is the second case I'm thinking, and the last case is China. Of course, according to David Harvey, China, since Deng Xiaoping, will belong to a case of neoliberalism. But I'm thinking of the case of the One Belt, One Road. If you see the One Belt, One Road, the participation are exclusively 47 or 48 state corporation. There's no participation of any bourgeois or private corporations. So I think that's also quite remarkable. I raised these three cases for potential applications of the idea.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we often discuss is that the structures that we understand. First of all, that there is that the corporate state is not the progression from the nation state, that they are institutions that work in parallel, that the nation state still exists and is strong, and that to understand what's happening to the nation state today, you have to bring in the factor of a corporate state, that it's not a territorialized entity. And I think that's something sometimes hard to conceive when you bring in this concept, this sort of, is it a state? What kind of state? Where is the government? It's not that kind of state, It's rather a force that organizes power in different spaces. Spaces that are, as Bruce was saying, outside of the nation state, but that determine the directions of the nation state. So that's something I was thinking about when Bruce was talking, but we often discuss, you know, the corporate state in different locations around the world has different characteristics as well. Different centers of power, different structures of application. So, I mean, I don't know enough about China, but the book that we're writing with Donald Nonini, John's work is from China, so I think he'll be able to bring some interesting contributions there.
I mean, to me, it's always an empirical matter in the end. That's how I work. So I work with an idea, but it's got to be, and you're right, everything you say is correct. You've got to work ultimately empirically. So it's, in relationship to China, the way I've been working, and Marina, it's out of the, from want of a better term, out of the Western end of things. I know nothing about China except what I've read on these sort of matters, Giovanni Arrighi's work and so on, which I find very, very interesting. And what you've just said as well is important. Obviously, the nature of this corporate state would have to take into account historical and different ways in which things have moved. But to get to Marina's point, it's not as if the nation state is gone. It's the nature of its internal structuring which has changed. I'd say that in all forms of the corporate state, depending on empirical analysis, there will be a strong anti-democratic, if they're in a sense it's built into the development of fascism. Fascism, of course, not being an attitude, but the relationship between certain types of political relations and corporate structures of some kind or another. So fascism seems to be, at least in Germany, very much that history. I think that the idea of it is to have a look at the way in which an actual order that we assume, and that needs a lot more examination as well, is radically transforming in its inner structures of organisation. It's in its process of reproduction. It's transformed out of all the kinds of patterns of organisation which condition the nature of that liberal nation state organisation that was brought into being. Of course I'm interested in the bourgeoisie and so on. That's again where I'm located. I don't know how the damn thing would, how the idea would travel, but it requires obviously much better empirical analysis than I can provide, and people like Marina do a much better job than I can. But I think it's worthwhile considering. I think, for example, patterns of warfare are totally related to this corporatized, which is not the same as saying it's a corporatization after a sort of, a multinational corporation, something like that. It's something which restructures the whole nature of social relations as well. And I think that's happening in all kinds of interesting ways as well, via things like digitalization. I'll give you an example, I mean a pretty crude example, but James Scott does an interesting book, I think, on the formation of the state in ancient Mesopotamia. And he's talking about the way in which the sort of legible dimensions of state organization, development of slavery, all related to various forms of agricultural production, the invention of a particular kind of grain that's easily measurable, storable, and transportable. Trade and so forth is based around these sort of things. But it's the measurability of things, it's the calculation of that measurability, the storage of it and so forth, the development of the productive system around it based on slavery and warfare. And out of that comes a particular kind of state formation. Well, I'm thinking along those sorts of lines, particularly in relationship to digitalization. What is so interesting about digitalization is its recreation of the nature of reality through and through. For example, if we just look at things like Facebook, or we look at what friendship is, the development of algorithms, all these sorts of things whereby something has to be measured and so forth. Everything, in a sense, can be measured and turned into a commodity of some kind or another via this digitalization process, which transforms the nature of sociality itself.
Not just social, but also like in political processes and in the processes of management, state management.
So, agreed. So I think that there's something which we really, which is, I think Zubov's thing is interesting, but the way in which the nature of state processes has got a technology and systems in its control that it can actually radically, in a sense, generate the very conditions of its own reproduction in a radical way. And I've been thinking about this in all kinds of ways, but I think it can how can I put it? If we look at a Gramscian analysis of forms of ideological control, state mechanisms feed into popular visions of reality and so forth, and operate their hegemonic control by operating with those kinds of relations and understandings. But in the situation of modern digitalization, which is a radical instrument, not just for globalization, but an instrument that relates to what I'm talking about as corporate state formation. It doesn't build on it. It doesn't only build on the ground. In a sense, creates the very circumstances of that, the very nature of that ground through its operations. Algorithms, for example, are an interesting thing to have a look at because they're actually creating the circumstances of their own existence. It's an ideology that works at great depth and with a great degree of control. I've got a sort of despairing view in a way, which I should be corrected. But I think that at the moment it's very hard to break out of the kinds of controls that are which are in a technological hands the market is taking on a new kind of meaning, and it invades every dimension of social life. And Facebook's a favorite example where they just new forms of advertising, for example, that every dimension of your action as a human being becomes measurable and saleable. And so the invasion, I think, this is what I think is interesting about the so-called notion of post-human means that we should be actually looking at other forms of life and so forth in order to understand things. But in a sense, there's a more sort of simple notion of post-human is that, in a sense, the human being is actually in the process of being redesigned within the political economic structures that we currently live in. So I think the nature of the ground of political economic control, which I'm understanding through this corporate state idea is extremely radical. The potentialities are extraordinary. And that's something that actually Don Nonini is working on, I think, in a very, very interesting way.
The big data now is the focal point of the American Chinese.
That's right. That's right.
problem.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So I think it's so that we should. I mean, we've talked about this throughout history. I mean, if we look at colonial rule, colonial systems created the conditions for their own reproduction. They redefined all sorts of things. If I look at, for example, caste in India, it transformed. It became what it is today in many ways through the very fact of the sort of merchant invasion of places like Kerala and so on. The rules of caste and so forth changed and hardened up in all kinds of ways in the interests of political reaction and economic control at the same time. So the colonial era created the ground of its own reproduction. But this is much more radical in current circumstances, I think. If I was to, again, sort of crude statement, but if I was to look at what's happening to middle classes, I mean, it's the sort of thing that would come out of Foucault or out of Willis and Latour and so on. The disciplining of social relations is much more radical now and controllable in relationship to political economic interest, which is the dominant, the economic, the profitability of every aspect of human existence and social relations is expanded in an extraordinary way, which has also involved massive new forms of exclusion. If I look at Brexit I don't know whether the same thing's happening in France. If I look at England now, you can't talk about a working class in the north. It's a class that's totally dispossessed of any capacity to work and has been extraordinarily marginalised in processes, and that's the one that in fact voted for Brexit. Okay, in a kind of inverse reactionism. And I think it's strong in all sorts of places. That's what got Trump into town as well. So the actual nature of class relations and the exclusions that are happening as a result of certain forms of disciplining and so on, I think are quite remarkable at the moment.
Just several things. First of all, how would you say that we translate, I'm discussing with some Chinese speakers here, but before I address your question, corporate state, 公司化国家、企业化国家 does that sound okay? 企业化，对不对？企业化 yeah. But I was thinking, so in Chinese that makes sense. But it focuses on this, how you operate, how you organize, how you run the government. Right? So corporate, like you run the government, the state as a corporate. You have your management or your levels, and your chief motive is to get across larger sectors and benefit and so on. But also you are talking about state formation, so you are thinking of this beginning with this East India Company, and then that is the emergence of this larger and larger government or state pursuing this profit and benefit from elsewhere. But through larger, but started from this ambitious and savage or aggressive, greedy can say entrepreneurs or this corporate actors. But I was thinking, how do you go beyond Marx or Wallerstein? And also, even just with Marx capitalism.
Well, I'm not ruling Wallerstein or Marx out of all. They're rather central.
The driving force, again, is the increase of capital. And through instrumentation, bureaucratic system, or the military control, they can expand, right? And to increase this benefit and profit and so on.
Yeah,
so it's always together. The capitalist desire with the state, right?
No, I think I look at it just slightly differently. Sort of agreeing with you, but one of the things that I'm playing with is that adopting Bergen, to some extent, the liberal state, the economic or the corporate organization are subordinated to various forms of political control. And if you take up Dalrymple, the early invasion of India, the corruption of that invasion, its feedback effect on English politics is brought under control within the politically moral order of the developing nation state. So the economy was contained nonetheless within the political order.
Yes.
With the current development, what's happened is the corporate structures have got their own governing organizations, some of their own creation, often highly egalitarian, incidentally, in their internal organization, like many of the big internet companies. But they have moved outside the control of the political, what we understand as the political in the state. They actually are not part of necessarily central organizations, except when they're brought in to actually do governmental work on contracts and so forth, a big aspect of the modern state. But nonetheless, the actual powers in that are external to the elected political order. And those external powers have got more or less free range, and they actually determine the political. In the earlier form, the political came to determine the economic or the condition.
That's the way how you conceive so-called polis. Now the polis is 天下, global.
Right.
Yeah, so it is not only one state or one city.
Oh, that's also true.
No, right. So the polis, the political, how you manage your goods, circulation and profit within that realm. So how large is the realm you perceive, right? So for nowadays, I was thinking, why don't you say this is a global corporate or corporation, but they are participants from different sectors, different movers. As we say, they are some very rich people, right? So, but we don't know who are the top, but they each has this
look at
right. They're competing.
They're competing within the organization.
Yes, right. And but how they this is the age of 天下 that is all under heaven. It's my realm. Like the internet. It's there, right? But of course, we can't have fight war here and there. But they are fighting against the war. Is on the internet too. But so I would think, yeah, right. So this political economy, there is no limit.
Yeah, I agree with that. If I have to look at, say, if I have to look at the political states I know something about, elections don't mean much anymore. It doesn't matter who you elect.
Sure. There's one coming up.
And this is something to do with what I would talk about.
Sure, I agree. Yeah. Yeah, no matter what party are ruling, I doesn't care. They are following the same pattern. They are doing the same thing. Yeah, internally and
Right.
domestically and also.
Right.
Yeah. Go ahead, don't be shy.
It seems to me that the expansion of what you call corporate state, this process has, let's say, some sort of a doppelganger, which is the return of a very simple form of the state, that is the gang of armed men. In other terms, the withering or the demise of the welfare state has a doppelganger, which is the expansion of the power of the police. It's very easy to see in a country like France, hospitals don't work anymore, but the violence of the police is expanding. It's very clear. So, okay, corporate state, but this dimension exists. So in that sense, the good old form of the state, as what I said, it's Engels' definition of the state. This does not disappear at all, just the opposite. I mean, both of them, corporate state and police democracy, yes, police democracy, it goes together.
Yeah, and you see that in Europe with populist
Everywhere.
governments intensifying.
No need of populist government. I mean, this does not make difference. Look, in France, are not supposed to be. They are supposed to be the clean, in according to West Europe patterns to be the clean part. I mean, Macron, by contrast with Salvini, but in terms of development, expansion of the democracy of police or police democracy, no difference.
But I think this stuff on, this is where I think you're right, but I think also, you know, what a lot of people are writing about is securitization, this whole thing about security. And that's operating in a way, there's another doppelganger. This whole idea of control. It's not just simply the Weberian monopolization of violence. No. It's this development of securitization. And this is about sealing off territories, controlling entrance and egress and so on. Very much like, you know, buildings are controlled with security personnel and so on.
And it's not just police as a state police.
That's right. There's all kinds of forms of control being elaborated to this highly diverse form of organization, and it's basically economic interests, which becomes, in a sense, a much more savage. That's what Marx was talking about, of course, this process, but it's much more savage at the moment, and this is, I think, the actual freeing of forms of economic production, control, expropriation of labour power, whatever. Even labour power is less a factor now. This is, I think, why there's so much money going into the sort of contradictions of capitalism being overcome by other kinds of processes which transform the nature of capital itself and its social base. That's what I'm trying to get at with the notion of the corporate state, which doesn't operate, it operates in fragmented territories. So the one corp, I don't want to get stuck into corporate organisation too much, although I think it's important, because this provides the framework. In a sense, it's already the framework of the social relations, the new social relations of power and state. And
Your model doesn't presume any, you say that there's a switching point, or for Marx, there's a long process of revolution. The dominated, they will request change or reform, but your corporation doesn't leave any space for
it's
change.
knocking it out, yeah.
Right. So there's no breaking point or a switch.
Well, there may be. I think there must be somewhere along. I'm not. I'd like to see. Well, I think one breaking point is this problem of
climate change.
Yeah, I mean just simple profit. I mean there's less and less people from whom profit can be somehow extracted, and a greater concentration on a smaller population. Of the middle classes, for example, are having to meet a much greater demand than before. I don't know how to think about this, and I'm probably bound to be wrong, but there's new forms of extraction.
Because I think it's the only thing that forces a different paradigmatic thought around the organization of resources, and that will require the restructuring of the state and the corporate interests in extractivist models. But I don't think it's anywhere close to happening. But if it doesn't happen through climate change, then I don't know if it will.
Moral calling doesn't work.
It's not moral, it's just the limits of the environmental system. Yeah.
The work that we heard yesterday on violence, unfortunately, it's gone. It's interesting to me because Africa seems to be a good example of corporate state expansion under no working outside regulatory structures. And so the collapse of Africa is very much related to that process. I think state systems are no longer working. Big state territories are fragmenting into different kinds of organisation and loci of power and so on. These are all affected by new forms of extraction and invasion in these places, all to do with the neo-imperialism on the western side of things that's going along with this, I think, which is also a transformation in the sort of, so I think that
we don't see the end yet. We don't see the end. I mean, resources, the mine, the rare mineral or oil, they all come with a military aggressiveness.
Certainly in Africa, that is okay.
Yeah, right. That's why we complained about one Belt One Road. Oh, the highway, the canal, there's a port they established is to build out a passageway to the things they want. There's no welfare. They're so motivated, to bring the mineral to this metal, and here heavy metal or whatever it is.
And there may be successful versions of it, though. Sort of forget your political leanings.
No. I'm just a very objective observer.
I mean, for example, a successful corporate state, which has all these transforms in it. We've just got one of the people on the project was studying this, is finished his PhD on it, and there's a lot of people working on it too, is Singapore. Singapore's an interesting place.
No, we were talking about Singapore as a corporate state. It's highly controlled.
Singapore is the most
terrible. It's very
successful example of corporate state.
Yeah, but our colleagues.
But what is very interesting is the welfare. Other people are sort of trying to adopt this, but not successfully. Australia is a good example. It's tried to operate the Singapore model in the total turning around of its welfare system, which was an old English welfare model that was adopted. But there's you see, if you receive welfare payments, you basically lose your citizenship rights. Okay, you become, in a sense, punished because you're not actually contributing to the benefits that you're receiving from the state. You receive benefits from the state in proportion to what you contribute to it. So you're well provided if you've got a good job, you're doing various sorts of things, you'll get various funds for all these sorts of things. But if you're a single mother, for example, without employment, you're kept on just about, it's uneconomic. And I just got a friend of mine that she wants to finish her PhD. She's a mature woman. And there's a thing called Centrelink, which runs according to Singaporean principles. Just has been going for about 10 years now, 15 years in Australia. But in order to get support, she's got to demonstrate that she's tried to get work that would be appropriate to her situation. And it's not just attempting, which used to be the old one. She's got to make something like 30 applications for jobs and demonstrate that she's made those applications and been turned down. So she's got to demonstrate that she's committed to work and that she's not somehow not contributing to the system, in order to get a pretty minimal payment to support her through this. So there's been a total shift in the way in which welfare and citizenship is considered. This is also, I think, a dynamic of what I'm trying to get at. Your human nature is actually in question.
Sure. You are of no merit or value if you cannot contribute, right?
It's sort of Marx's nightmare.
Totally alienated. Yeah, just pure force. But how does it start, or whether that wasn't there before 18th century or 16th century? Whether there are other forms to see how people use a slave to build a huge tower or temple or wall, then how do they expand their realm to grab other people's treasuries? So the greediness and the savageness and the control of the army and building up roads to get to the place they want to go. I was thinking, when does human nature change? It may be always were there, but the advancement or development of technology, techniques, that would change. Otherwise, in the primitive way, they can be more brutal. They just take it. They don't need a cost.
We've got a book coming on the stage, and one of the things that I think we need to, at least it's a long-term interest in anthropology, social science, general political science, is the question of the state. But I think, all the questions and comments I think the whole nature, the question of the state really needs to be asked again and quite thoroughly, the very different formations and so forth.
Yeah.
We need to, because we use this word in sort of one big abstract blob. We need to be carefully looked at again. But one relationship to it is the nature of slavery. And of course Marx's concern, the development of industrial slavery. But slavery is fundamental to the formation of the state, I think. But there's a sense in which the new transformations are enslaving populations in a much deeper and radical way than I think before.
Or the other way, to turn the other way around, we could see that the state is a mode or structure to moderate or limit different actors' ambition. I mean, that is government. But that, of course, could not really prevent people's ambition and greediness, especially when the state is owned by some agent that can privatize the whole state. So the state supposedly, or we say republican or republic, supposedly it should be a coexistence. Like corporate itself is a collaboration of, right? But when does it start to become unrestrained or become totally greedy? Through systematic, legal, institutional measures, and of course military support to expand. So I think the corporate itself or the state itself doesn't necessarily mean a villain, but so that behind it, what is the driving force? Yeah.
Thank you.
No, I was thinking to look more into some historical cases and other things could at least help me to think all these issues.
It was interesting to me with my work on Sri Lanka. I've done quite a bit on the war in Sri Lanka. It went on for a long time, in which case, over a period in which there are these state transformations occurring. As you move out, as I would see it, into the corporate type of structure, the actual pattern of warfare and hostilities began to radically change. So I'm interested in the effects of these transformations.
I think that's actually exciting and also very persuasive when we think of this East India Company and then how they take over these provinces and then the military camp and then the expansion, the Opium War, this, the open ports of China and Japan, Korea, and so on. And they take over all this land, kingdoms, and divide them, and then distribute them according to this arbitrary construct of race and so on. Of course, it's there. Yeah, I was just thinking.
Well, Dalrymple would be beautifully applied to China and the Opium Wars and the invasion. Much more extreme.
But again, I was thinking these Southeast Asian countries or Chinese, they are not just innocent people. They were greedy, big commercial troops. They always are armed in China in past history. They are northern part, southern part, and they are always armed with their merchant commodity shipping and so on. And also there are several ways to do it, by the road or by the canal river and so on. But there are people in between, they benefit or they control the whole transaction.
Military balance.
Yeah.
Since we talked about it yesterday.
Yeah, it's always there.
Well, it's all an attempt to sort of, that's why Marina's work is interesting. I look at the, I mean, the real, corporate state in a sense, is of course the USA. its internal fragmentation, its continual internal fragmentation reflects those kinds of dynamics. And then that passed on to Latin America to a great extent. All the sort of coups and so forth seem to be working along these lines.
Oh yeah, for sure. All in the interests of the United Fruit Company in Central America determined every government, and the military trained all of the guerrilla movements, and today it happens differently through the World Bank.
Yeah.
It's just different kind of diplomacy, but it's the same kind of intervention in the interests of U.S. corporate capital.
Sure.
Well, the World Bank was a major instrument in the transformation of all these. We talked about Sri Lanka. I think it was Sri Lanka which was the first place that went in for structural adjustment type policies, and that created the conditions for the outbreak of the ethnic war in Sri Lanka.
Students, questions, comments? 也可以用中文，有翻译。
很主。
有些有吗？ All about governments in the Middle East.
I'm not sure how to see, because sometimes when we define the government in Middle East, it's difficult to compare to others. Is that really we can compare it to corporate states in Western country, for example, or in China, especially after the 2011 and Arab Spring.
Yeah.
Also, if we see like Gulf countries where they are heavily dependent on oil, really is the government is the economic in the same time. Yeah. So I'm not sure how we can apply this concept in Arab countries or in Middle East countries.
Well, it's an empirical question.
Sure.
All those sorts of questions are empirical. You can only be answered. If you can't apply it, the empirical work doesn't work.
Doesn't mean that it's universally applicable. I mean, I'm still looking at many East Asian societies. I said, well, I don't really see this kind of corporate state.
Yeah.
I mean, you see the state, but it's of course you always have business interests and things.
But they're
like,
still royal families.
Yeah, or, of course,
like
affecting votes, affecting all sorts of things, but that's not exactly the kind of model of corporate state that's being, what we're, I think, in the strong sense of state becoming a corporation or using corporate processes as a way of legitimating itself. I still don't see that much in, say, Japan or Taiwan. It doesn't really operate that way.
Not yet.
Singapore, yeah.
Singapore, yeah.
I mean, even in Hong Kong, where there's a lot of influence of the oligarchs or what have you, it's not necessarily a corporate state. That's not the same thing.
Or in Malaysia or Indonesia, they have parallel legal systems, I guess. Right? They have their Muslim or Islamic law for certain provinces, so the different provinces, they have their own sort of autonomy.
You could always say that they're affected by other kinds of interests that don't seem to. That's the easy way of explaining it, I suppose. But even in China, I mean, Yeah, I haven't really had this discussion with Don yet, but I've seen his work, and you know, I agree with him. You know, I think basically the whole problem is that it's not so much with the conceptualization of the corporate state as you define it, but most of the academic discourse is still stuck on neoliberalism. That's the problem, and there's a lot of flaws in that, because neoliberalism, I mean, the two versions of this, right? One that comes out of the neoconservative Austrian school, and the other out of Foucault. You see the state, but it's not really the direct, you know, sort of object of inquiry here. It's a way of talking about a kind of state formation, but as a product of a certain kind of movement of capitalism. That's what neoliberalism claims to be. But if you look at it that way, obviously it's not. It doesn't really fit a lot of places. Certainly, it doesn't. I mean, you see a certain collusion between corporate interests and the state in China, but I don't see it as a neoliberal model for the same reasons that Don does. And I agree with him there. But on the other hand, it's something else to say that, you know, the Chinese state is a corporatist. Is corporatist. I don't think it operates that way either. So I think there's still room for a lot of.
Hold on. I'm being pretty primitive. You know, a concept is something which organizes your thought. It's not necessarily, you know, a hard and fast object. You know, so when I use the word state, that's why I'm saying we better examine what we mean by that, because it means many different things under different you know, ways in which you think about it. When we think about a nation state, the problem about the nation state is we think of it in territorial terms.
Yeah.
You know, and which also defines the limits of its sovereignty. But if I think through a concept like corporate state, I'm immediately beginning to think differently. That is, I don't think in terms of a defined territory. Actually, it in fact is without territory in that whole nation-state sense. So that if I'm looking at the kinds of processes that are going on in a particular political zone, like England or Australia or something that thinks of it as a territory, the controls over that are from a range of sources external to that place. It has very little, in fact, in looking at it through the notion of a corporate state, it has very little control over its own processes. It's actually determined by things that really are not within its major domain of what it thinks to be its control. It's not controlling much, actually. That's certainly the case if I was to look at you know, the main economy of Australia is both its minerals and its agriculture. Most of that's controlled, not by the state. Not even its regulations are determined by what look to be state bureaucracies. They've got to follow a whole range of processes which are really external to them to a large extent. So, but before I sort of lose myself on that point, any concept is a way of thinking. It's not necessarily a physical entity. So when you think a la the corporate state, you think it a little differently from the way you would if you're using concepts like nation state. Also, it's a better way, I think, of thinking about the kinds of problems that come up under the term neoliberalism.
And globalization.
Yeah, well, and globalization. In fact, you know, beginning to look at it through that concept, I can tell you something more about globalization than just as, you know, a term. That seems to me to be a function of concept in a very primitive sense. It's a way of thinking. It's not necessarily saying that this thing exists in absolute, you know, physical form. It's going to have masses of varieties, and at a certain point the varieties are going to break it down.
Well, what I was trying to say was that, in a sense, that's the merits of your approach, because the primary object of inquiry is the state, and you have to frame it that way.
Right.
Okay, so it's different from neoliberalism, because neoliberalism really comes out of a discourse of capitalism that makes implications about state formation, which is something else.
I'd agree with that, but I also I don't like neoliberalism, the main way in which my colleagues seem to operate it, which is almost in terms of a left-right notion. That's neoliberalism, and somehow I'm not. I would sort of say that we're actually all within this neoliberal thing. To think outside it requires another way of thinking about it, that seems to me, rather than just labeling stuff neoliberalism. Yeah, and to see, you know...
I certainly can see merits in talking about the state from a kind of corporate perspective as something that sort of transcends or replaces or is better than the territorial model. But you know, the part of the problem is that if you look at the conception of the nation-state, I mean, that's a pretty muddy discourse too.
Sure.
What is it? Sure. You know, I think almost everyone agrees that, see, we're looking at something, but we all disagree on what we're looking at and how it came about and so on. So, you know, that's the problem. I mean, in that sense, yeah, I mean, I can tell you almost anything is better than what we have now, but it's still pretty muddy.
I agree.
I'm not even convinced that territory is the paradigmatic aspect of what we call nation state. It happens to be one of the prominent phenomena associated with it, but I haven't come across any persuasive interpretations of why. I mean, it's only one of so many things. It's standardization of language. It's in Anderson's case, it's territory. Yes, it's a whole bunch of things. That's the whole problem. And then all we're really talking about is the modular nation state. You see, if the other part of Anderson was the nation state really started in Latin America. Well, you know.
Yes, Anderson had interested me. That's why I'm interested in this sort of Gutenberg moment stuff and digitalization. I mean, the central point in Anderson, as I understand him, is this notion of print capitalism, and the alterations of concepts, time, space, etc., with nationalism that develops in that, and so everyone's walking through the same time, space dimension. Whatever part of the country you're moving in, you're involved in the same temporal, spatial dimension, and it relates to this notion of print capitalism that he gets, which is out of which is a force in sort of nationalist ideology and forms of what we call the nation state, I suppose, in ideological terms. But this digitalization, that's something much more radical than print, and with a far greater reach, right into the radical constitution of the person, and it doesn't require literacy. It doesn't, it works in another kind of way, in a very radical sense, I think. And
that obviously, see, that obviously transcends territoriality.
Yeah, sure.
If you think about it, you know, we don't have to print out papers anymore. We just forward PDF files, right?
Right.
Or we use cloud services or what have you. I mean, you know, I don't have to go to my office. I mean, you know, that you know, there should be all sorts of ramifications just on that.
I mean, it's. You know, I think I gave a talk. I'm stumbling around that area, but that's out of my ritual stuff, my ritual materials. But on images and all this sort of stuff. But I am interested in people on this. I like Frederick Jameson and so forth, and the sort of postmodern image-based systems. But the radical nature of that now with digitalization, I think is extraordinary. At least it needs to be carefully looked at. That's where I think Benedict Anderson is really interesting, to sort of take up the print capitalism and then translate it into the current situation. The controls are enormous. Possibilities are enormous. And just in the Brexit election, the amount of information that was going through the internet and convincing people, which was totally aside from newspapers, journals, the radio.
Sorry, I still hate Jameson in that regard. I still hate Jameson in that regard. I mean, reducing everything to images and digital form. See, I started out in engineering, so I have a very different conception of the world. Yeah, we forget that what we see as digital image was actually produced by people writing software codes. You know, it runs through computers, which is hardware. You can't produce what we see as images without it. There's a system of production here. We assume that, you see, that's what we see. I mean, of course, it's easy to say, yes, it has all kinds of ramifications for that, but that's the stuff that has to be produced, and you forget, you know. What happens if you take away that production part?
I couldn't agree with you more. So you need to look at the production.
That's why I kind of like people like Hitler. I mean, typewriter, phonograph, and so on. I forget what the last part of it was. I mean, what he's really describing in the media, sort of the revolution in media, is not so much the images, but that it has to be processed somehow, information. That's what it is. You see, that there's transitions between those kinds of what we call analog to digital or blah, 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 blah. But it's not so much a function of the image per se, but how this gets processed as information. That's you know, somebody has to be doing that. Now, I don't know anything about computer language, but it seems to me, wow, if you can write a language that changes the way that you process information. I mean, I think every computer programmer knows that these languages are very different, whether it's Fortran or blah blah blah. I have no idea what they're talking about. You know, if that changes.
I don't think they operate anymore.
Yeah, I know, but
it's in my childhood.
Yeah, I know, but you see, the languages is what makes possible that what we call this digitalization.
Yeah, I agree with you, but I'm back to James Scott again. You see, I mean, what you're saying in a sense is what James Scott was doing with the discovery of a particular kind of grain that was storable and measurable, and that related to a particular kind of productive process which required large amounts of labour, slavery, warfare, state formation on that basis. You're saying something similar, I think, that you look at the way in which a particular thing, like the digitalization of reality, it's basic down to its 1-0 binary structure, and you're operating a mathematical system, a probabilistic way of predicting how relations may be formed. You've got to get your Facebook pages organized and being able to measure things for people to define themselves as friends or not friends and so on. You're actually setting up a whole way in which, to follow you, relations are produced. But in producing those relations, you're producing a particular thing which becomes that reality, or that actuality, which is not based on anything but the actual programming system that you're operating and the code that you're doing. And so I think there's quite a lot of stuff coming out which would interest you on that point, about how these apps and so forth are constructed, and how people are working their relations and imagining their relations through these applications, which have got their own limitations, and therefore they're actually something different from what we understand them to be. And they've got all sorts of implications for them, I think. And I just think that I'm not disagreeing with you at all. If you look at the productive system is radically altering so many aspects of what we are and what we do, and rendering them measurable and usable for the extraction of profit, for example, to an amazing degree. And what does big data do? Big data is looking at everything. It's how you talk to your friends on Facebook becomes apparently usable information for certain types of marketing processes and so on. So, but what I'm also saying is they're constituting the very process that they're using to make money from, and they're therefore creating a social world, which is not it's a human creation, but not the creation of the people engaging in the interaction. If we look at, to me it's very interesting, just at a very elementary level. If we look at, say, Irving Goffman's work, which I think is great, on interaction, how people build up their relations and change them. So we used to teach our courses with this sort of stuff. But now we've got other ways in which relations are built up, and it's moving through our computer systems and so on, in which in a sense we think we're creating, but we're actually limited by a particular program which sets the parameters of how we're to define each other. Very different from the way in which, could I say, normal social interaction develops. But a lot of interaction is being mediated by these systems. So, and I think this, then if I propel it a bit into the way larger systems of interest may want to use this stuff, like in relationship to security or face recognition or profiling people and so on. Not only is it sort of acting on what is a world out there, but it's in a sense creating that world out there at the same time. To me, that's really quite radical. Of course, you do that all the time with language, which has got its own parameters. That's why we're interested in language. And you do it with print. But in some sort of way, I'm suggesting that this is much more radical than even those things. And that's transforming the whole circumstance of our existence, which makes Benedict Anderson useful to think with. But there's a new set of parameters that's being developed, which is usable in a way, in a much more radical way, by political interests or economic interests.
Well, we'll all be dead by then.
I'll certainly be dead well before then.
Maybe that's a bit too much to think about.
Yeah, right. Another 3 hours or more.
Any sort of questions or comments about anything? Really? Yeah.
我想问一个问题，就是
等一下，
我好奇的是弱势团体的平等要怎么在这个
对不起，就是大声一点。
我想问的是弱势团体的平等要怎么落实在这样子的一个国家概念中？
最后一句听不见。
可不可以解释一下？
就是因为我觉得这个概念在讲很多的，就是国家它其实本身里面也是有很多的权利在做一个，就是我觉得弱势的人他们没有 power， 那他们要怎么在这个里面有一个立足之地？
我不太了解这个问题，所以可不可以再讲清楚一点？
就我在想说，现在讨论讲到的，可以影响到。你在想什么？就是可以影响到军事啊、经济啊这些条约跟合作的感觉，都是比较有权力的一个团体或组织。那如果是没有这类权力的人跟团体，他们可以做什么
？Basically, she was asking within all the systems, how do we see any chance or space for the minority group or those people who are not heard or seen or visible, right? Or very disempowered. The disempowered people. But basically, that's it.
Yeah, I'm trying to think.
The displaced people of the subaltern were totally unprivileged people.
I think there's always space for minority and
janitor.
I mean, all I would say, I mean, I've been presenting the negative side of things. There's always lots of positives. It seems to me that in the digitalizing process, there's a lot more visibility of people that have been rendered invisible by systems than before. Maybe there's Negri, Hart and Negri on. I mean, they argue that the digitalization is a process whereby that's the area where the greatest resistance is going to come, and various groups that have been excluded and so forth will have force in it, and it seems to be the case. All I'm saying is that a pessimistic view, which I shouldn't have, at the moment I sense that any form of resistance, whether it's from minorities or people that are more powerful within the system, is going to be harder and harder. It's going to be very, very difficult for for systems to be overturned. So although we are, I think, entering a revolutionary moment, it's as if I sort of feel that the revolutions will go along. But the political orders of the ones that are controlling and actually setting things up for destruction and so forth will be able to move much more freely than they have done in the past. I've got a simple, again, I'm simple-minded on all this. But I mean, look at the power of there was a time when the states needed to convince their populations of the necessity for war, and in fact had to gain their support. Tremendous amount of ideological involvement to get them, because they had to fight the wars. The population that they needed, and they managed to kill a lot of them by convincing them to go to war. But now we've got a situation which alters the nature of power altogether. It can operate, to some extent it's alienated. It can operate independently. Small groups of people can operate independently of the need to control the will of others. A simple example is drone warfare, which enables a fair amount of radical destruction to be done without having to enlist anyone's will in order to do it. It's just a person operates a drone machine. but it doesn't need a population to agree to that. So the nature of power in nation states is altering radically, I would have thought, because of the nature of the technology of warfare itself and and what can be done. So it, in a sense, disempowers minorities, if I can put it that way, or good sections of the people from protesting against certain types of dynamics that the government may commit them to. That's what I think, which alters the whole nature of the way in which power operates. You know, again, I get back to the corporate state, maybe, that when I said earlier, that not only is democracy, as we understand it, in its best forms, threatened, but the space within which the democratic operates begins to shrink. It's working in a much narrower way. So when you go off and place your vote, you're really placing a vote about very limited things. It's very interesting, for example, that England's just voted a government into power for I think they're going to be in power for something like 15 years. It's going to take 15 years to get them out on a normal democratic process on a single issue. The idea of leaving the European Union. I mean, that's, and in fact, the Labour Party fought the election on multiple issues and lost because of that. It had to fight on a single issue. And so I think this also tells you about the contraction of the space of the democratic. And what we understand as fascism is not the sort of thing that the Nazis necessarily, it may have the same effect that the Nazis produced, but it's really the massive deprivation of the capacity of people to affect through the vote, through their political action, what is happening to them. I think that's the case. So on minorities, I think they get a lot of voice through digitalization. That's a plus, and a lot of exposure and representation. But what effect that might have on the actual political social order, I don't know. Look at the, again, I have to use England as I've just been, just come out of it. If you look at England, there's a lot of voice given to minority interests of all kinds. A good sort of liberal English position. But at the same time, there's a fantastic amount of repressive action in a sense. You know, there's a huge amount of voice at the same time, an intensive growth, massive growth in the structures of repression. And that's what I'm also thinking is a dimension of one of the effects of corporate state formation. I don't know whether that answers but that's just enough. You know, like Deleuze writes on opinion, and what are you getting from me? There's a lot of opinion.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank everybody and the speakers.
Thank you very much. I didn't thank you enough for looking after us. We're finishing up tomorrow, but we've had a wonderful time here. And, it's been terrific to meet you as well.